The last decade of the 19th century was a period of immense change across the world and, of course, across Wales. It was a decade that was shaped by industry, migration, global tension, political transformation, and cultural shifts that affected not just Wales, not just Britain, but the entire world itself. And it was forcing a reconsideration of a number of assumptions that were happening around this time period. And it was creating a new philosophy, a new understanding of technology and how we worked with it. It gave us a bunch of different things which we didn't know about going into this century. And it was completely and radically changing everything we ever knew. More on that after the break. 1890s were a decade of global acceleration. Across the world, economies expanded, empires hardened their borders, and new technologies reshaped daily life. Political movements, of course, challenged long-standing power structures, and for the people in places like Wales and in the wider world, it was no longer a distinctly distant and abstract place. Very few places in the world hadn't been visited. Very few places were not necessarily understood. And slowly but surely, the world was narrowing and getting smaller because of this. That has massive implications. It, of course, means that the world arrives in daily newspapers, through shipping routes, through letters from relatives overseas, missionary reports, and the rhythm of global trade. Wales enters the final decade of the 19th century, deeply entangled in the international system of labor, empire, finance, and culture. So, to give a background before we go back into Wales proper, let's talk initially about Europe. Europe in the 1890s was wealthy, industrialized, and uneasy. Britain, Germany, and France dominated manufacturing and trade, while newer states such as Italy sought their place on the world stage. Germany's rapid industrial growth after unification in 1871 reshaped global markets, particularly in steel and chemicals. This mattered directly to Wales, where steel workers in places like Aberfyle and Dowlais competed with this increasingly international marketplace. Politically, Europe was defined by alliances and anxieties. Nationalism had intensified in Central and Eastern Europe. Military spending increased to match it, and diplomatic crises were closely followed in British newspapers, including, of course, those read in Welsh homes. Although Wales was not a political entity in its own right at this point, the Welsh voters, MPs, and editors were acutely aware that Britain's global position rested on industrial strength, maritime power, and access to overseas resources. Welsh coal, exported from Cardiff and Swansea, fueled navies, factories, and railways across Europe. Africa of this period is undergoing rapid and often violent transformations as European powers carved the continents into colonies. The so-called scramble for Africa intensified, if anything, driven by competition for land, minerals, and strategic advantage. Britain expanded its influence in the south and eastern part of Africa, while France, Germany, and Belgium consolidated their own empires. For Wales, Africa was not distant. Welsh missionaries had long been active in southern Africa, and their letters were regularly printed in Welsh language newspapers. Welsh engineers, miners, and skilled workers emigrated to work in railways, mines, and ports. Capital raised in Britain, including in Welsh investment, flowed into African mining ventures. The politics of empire, debates about morality, and the human cost of colonial expansion were often discussed in chapels and political meetings across Wales well before open conflict captured headlines. Asia of the 1890s was a region under immense pressure. British Empire governed India directly following the events of 1857, and the Indian markets remained central to the imperial trade. Welsh manufactured goods from tin plate to textiles found markets across the subcontinent. Indian tea, cotton, and jute arrived in Welsh ports, reinforcing the economic connections that had shaped everyday assumptions and consumptions. China faced internal unrest and increasing pressure from European powers and Japan. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 95 signaled a shift in global power, demonstrating that industrial modernization could upend established hierarchies. Japanese industrial growth was watched closely by British commentators, including those concerned about the future competition in steel and shipping. These developments reinforced a sense that the world economy was becoming faster and more competitive and less predictable. And now we come to North America. North America at this point is defined by expansion and industrial consolidation. The United States emerged as a global industrial power, producing steel, coal, and manufactured goods on vast scales. American demand for coal and steel influenced global prices, which in turn affected wages and employment in Welsh industries. The reach of the United States in this period magnified in a way that it never had before. At the end of the Civil War, you have a massive industrialization that had only just really started up till then, now exploded, and you have a massive migration from the south to the north to try and fill the jobs that were rushing out and going everywhere at that point. You also had massive industrial magnates that controlled much of the finances of the era and were seen as some of the oligarchs of American influence that would feel somewhat similar to some of what's going on today. This Gilded Age meant that United States and Canada by extension, who also was having their own version of this, were seen as places to move to. Mining communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Nova Scotia maintained strong cultural ties to Wales because people were migrating from Wales to these places. Letters home spoke of labor struggles and economic booms and social change. Welsh newspapers frequently printed correspondence from abroad, reminding readers that the nation extended far beyond its geographic borders. In South America, the Welsh settlement in Patagonia continued to adapt and survive in a very difficult climate, in a very difficult situation with less and less support by the local government. These communities reinforced the idea that Welsh identity could persist and evolve in a global context. We've talked more in depth about Patagonia. I don't want to go over it again here, but you understand where we're coming from in that idea. Australia and New Zealand were settler societies shaped by British migration and colonial governance. Both experienced economic depression during this decade, a reminder that global capitalism carried risks as well as opportunities. Welsh migrants were part of these societies and worked in the mining and farming and urban trades there. Reports of strikes, political reform, and women's suffrage in Australasia reached Wales, offering alternative models of social and political organization, one that would have an inspiration to those already fighting this struggle. Wales in the 1890s was not watching these developments from the sidelines, but it was supplying the energy that it had to offer to the world, sending people across oceans, absorbing ideas from abroad, and debating its place within Britain and the empire at large. The coal beneath Welsh valleys powered ships that connected the continents. Welsh labor built railways, ports, and industries thousands of miles away. Welsh culture, language, and religion traveled with migrants and missionaries even as the global forces reshaped life at home. This was in the context in which Wales approached the end of the 19th century. A small nation by size, but deeply embedded in a global system that was faster and more interconnected and more volatile than anything previous generations had known. To understand Wales in the 1890s, we must first understand this wider world because it shapes what the Welsh lives were like and how it created a new and different society going into the 1900s. By 1890, Wales was a nation already transformed by the Industrial Revolution. Coal, slate, copper, tin plate, and steel reshaped the landscape and the economy. According to the 1891 census, the Welsh population had reached over 1.7 million, more than doubling the previous 70 years. Urbanization accelerated, and Cardiff, Swansea, Merthyr Tydfil, and Newport expanded rapidly as ports and industrial hubs. Cardiff was now the preeminent coal exporting port in the world, a fact reported both in the Times and the South Wales Daily News in 1890. Railway had connected even remote communities, and the telegraph had brought near instant communication. Wales was no longer distant from global ideas or events. International news arrived through the newspaper, such as the Western Mail, which dedicated entire pages to foreign affairs alongside Welsh local coverage, much like our own newspapers and media do today. Now, that doesn't mean everything was all about the economy, but it certainly had a huge effect. The 1890s had begun with optimism. Coal exports continued to rise, feeding a ferocious energy demand of Europe and North America, as they too began to industrialize heavily. The coal fields of Rhondda and Aberdare and in the eastern valleys reached new heights. Output from South Wales coal fields surpassed 50 million tons in 1890, recorded in that year's Mining Journal annual review. Wages for miners fluctuated but were generally steady early in the decade, giving many working families a sense of improvement and stability, something that's incredibly important to all of us. Yet, beneath the surface lay tensions. Employers pressed for greater productivity as seams became more difficult to reach. Miners demanded protection, fair pay, and safer conditions. Explosions, roof falls, and accidents remained a constant fear and a constant reality. The Gresford and Senghenith disasters were still in the future, but their roots were visible in the culture of long hours and cost-cutting and industrial risk that shaped the 1890s. Union membership grew significantly during those years. South Wales Miners' Federation, established in 1898, emerged from the decades of labor unrest and local organization across the coalfields. Newspapers such as the Cambrian documented meetings in workmen's halls where miners debated wages and safety. The rise of labor politics foreshadowed the political landscape of the early 20th century, where this was all going to hit in the end. The slate industry, particularly in Carnarvonshire and Merionethshire, also saw conflict. Tensions culminated in the long and bitter strike at Penhuron Quarry, which began in 1896. This dispute would dominate the lives of quarrymen and their families for years, and by 1900 had already attracted national attention. The dispute was well covered by the North Wales Chronicle and the Herald Cymraeg, both reporting of the growing hardship in Bethesda and the deepening split between the workers and owners. The 1890s were, of course, marked with worldwide imperial competition, technological innovation, and social upheaval and political upheaval, and all of these would affect Wales directly. First of all, we'll start by where we ended off last week, or the last episode, talking about emigration, which remained a powerful feature of Welsh life. While fewer left than had in the mid-19th century, many still departed for the United States, Canada, Australia, and South Africa. Shipping logs from Cardiff, Swansea, and Liverpool recorded Welsh passengers headed to New York, Montreal, and Buenos Aires. Letters printed in Welsh newspapers showed families staying connected across the continent, sharing news about wages, land prices, strikes, and storms, all of which would be of interest to relatives both in Wales and outside of it. At the same time, immigration into Wales continued. Italians, as we mentioned last time, opened cafes and ice cream shops in towns like Merthyr, Llanelli, and Cardiff. Jewish families fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe settled in Cardiff, Swansea, and Newport, and the valleys were contributing to the trade and cultural life. Censuses record from 1891 to 1901 that there was a demonstrable growth in these communities. The British Empire was nearing its greatest territorial extent. Events in Africa, India, and China filled Welsh newspaper columns. Concerns about imperial security, trade access, and missionary activity were debated in chapels, reading rooms, and political clubs. Reports on the First Matabele War and European competition in East Africa reached Wales weekly. Although this episode avoids details discussing the Boer War, which we're going to cover later, it is important to understand that by the late 1890s, the situation in southern Africa was already affecting Welsh readers. Editorials in the Western Mail and the South Wales Daily News warned of rising tensions between Britain and the Boer republics. Welsh volunteers who had emigrated earlier to the Cape Colony wrote letters back to families in Wales describing the political debates and social division in the region, all of which was causing distress and concern. Of course, at the end of the day, the central component of Welsh life at this stage is religion. It remains central to the Welsh identity. Nonconformist chapels dominated communities across the country. The 1890s saw vigorous debates about disestablishment of the Church of England in Wales. The Cymru Fydd movement, spearheaded by figures such as T.E. Ellis and David Lloyd George, promoted the idea of Welsh self-respect and national development. Many speeches were printed in the Ingedli Gymraeg and the Banner ac Amserai Cymru, urging Welsh people to take pride in their culture and their political voice. Eisteddfodau flourished, blending traditions with modern concerns. At the 1896 National Eisteddfod in Llandudno, discussions ranged from literature to industrial safety and education reform. Newspapers recorded growing interest in Welsh history, folklore, and the Welsh language. The decade witnessed the publication of important works such as Owen M. Edwards' historical writings and continued the success of Cymru, the periodical he founded in 1891. Parallel to that, the Welsh Intermediate Education Act of 1889 had begun to bear fruit with new county schools opening throughout Wales in the early 1890s. Reports from the Central Welsh Board show enrollment rising and more students, including girls, gaining access to higher levels of education. This decade laid the groundwork for more literate and politically aware population. And this is happening at the same time that university expansion is happening in Wales, because we're seeing growth in other universities and other communities outside of Aberystwyth. Growing towns brought challenges, and public health campaigns expanded, often driven by local councils responding to disease outbreaks. In 1893, the typhoid outbreak in Bangor and the 1898 outbreak in Swansea and Cardiff prompted sanitation reform. Medical officers of health published annual reports discussing sewage disposal, water quality, and overcrowded housing. Housing reform became a major political issue. In industrial valleys, terraced housing spread rapidly, sometimes with minimal planning. Parliamentary committees investigated living conditions in the mining districts and heard testimony from Welsh miners and their families about the damp rooms, limited ventilation, and poor drainage. And you can definitely see how you combine that with overcrowding, because most families at this point are having multiple children and they're having relatives live with them. You can see just how much worse it all turns in that situation, in that environment. The 1890s also saw an increased visibility of women in public life. Women had always been a part of public life, but they had never been as obvious as they were now. Women participated in local elections as poor law guardians, school board members. Reformers such as Rosemary Crashay continued to promote women's education and literacy development and achievement. The women's suffrage movement developed Welsh branches, which then held meetings in Cardiff, Swansea, and Wrexham. Reports of these gatherings, of course, appear in the local newspapers. Industrial work also shaped women's lives. The tin plate workforce in Carmarthenshire and Glamorgan included women known as tin plate girls, who performed vital roles in sorting and finishing. Employment records and factory reports from the 1890s show women's work remained essential but underpaid. And that is something we will delve much more into in the coming episodes. The final decade of the century, of course, brought one other major adjustment, which was the change in technology. Electrical lighting began to appear in Welsh towns. Cardiff installed electric streetlights in 1891, and Swansea followed later in the decade. Telephones, the most newest of fangled things, was starting to spread at this point, although I'd argue not very far. Railway travel had become more comfortable and affordable, opening leisure travel for working families, which was now becoming less of a novelty and more of a reality. Excursion trains to seaside resorts like Barry, Porthcawl, and Llandudno became common, often documented in holiday advertisements in local newspapers. Photography grew increasingly accessible, capturing images of communities, workplaces, and family life. Many of the iconic photographs of statesmen, miners, and chapel congregations are usually found in this decade. Politically, in the 1890s were dominated by the Liberal Party of Wales. Home rule for Ireland, Welsh disestablishment, and land reform and labour rights featured heavily in debates across Wales. The Cymru Feed movement represented a growing desire for Welsh political self-confidence and self-actualization. Although the movement would fracture by the late 1890s, its impact on the Welsh national identity was significant. Trade unionism and labor organization expanded, especially in coal and the slate fields. These developments laid the groundwork for later emergence of the Labour Party as a major force in Welsh politics. And we're going to talk a lot about the Labour Party over the next few decades. It feels like next few episodes anyway. I would argue that they'll probably be a major feature for at least a good portion of political conversations for a long time to come at this stage. As 1900 approached, Welsh communities faced both confidence and uncertainty. Economically, coal industry remained strong, yet signs of strain were visible. Social movements were reshaping public life. Women demanding greater rights, workers calling for fairer conditions and political representation. Cultural revivals strengthened the pride in Welsh heritage and language. World developments reached Wales more quickly than ever before through press and telegraph. From the rising tensions in Africa to the growth of European alliances, these international events had shaped the atmosphere in Wales in which people lived, debated, and imagined their future. The decade closed in a sense that the world was changing very rapidly. As one editorial in the Western Mail put it in 1899, the new century approached with both hope and anxiety in Wales. Like the rest of Britain, it felt the weight of modernity. The foundation laid in the 1890s would define Welsh life for decades to come. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening or viewing today. If you have any questions, comments, and concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can also reach me on most social media at Welsh History Pod, the one exception being Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. If you would like, you can also help out with the podcast through Patreon. We do take funding through that and definitely appreciate any funds that anybody ever donates. It's always appreciated. And that can be found at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you, everyone. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. We'll talk to you later. Take care and have yourself a wonderful week. Thank you. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.